This is a video I have had in the works for a while about diseases that are in some sense alive, meaning that they are made out of genetic material that can replicate and basically reproduce themselves in order to spread. Before explaining each of these types of diseases and what they are and how they work, I first want to explain what the human body is from a biological perspective. The human body is a collection of cells that make up various systems that keep the human body alive in different ways. Each part of the body is made of a different type of cell. One type of cell makes up your brain and nerves, another type makes up your bones, another type makes up your heart, another type makes up your lungs, and so on and so forth. In order to keep the human body alive and functioning, each type of cell periodically clones itself and creates more cells of its type as the old cells die off. Each of the types of diseases we will be talking about are also made out of cells that clone themselves in order to spread. Warning, some of the content of this video may be disturbing to some viewers and may cause some feelings of paranoia. The information also may not be entirely accurate, as I am no expert in pathology and am just explaining according to my limited understanding. I recommend looking to the sources I will provide in the info box for further reading. Please do not try to diagnose yourself with any of the illnesses talked about here. If you think you may have symptoms of any of them, consult an actual doctor. Viruses and bacteria are not the same thing. Bacteria are tiny living things that can live inside you, and some species are helpful while others are harmful. Viruses are not quite alive. They are tiny capsules of genetic information. They have some characteristics of living things, but not others. And one of the differences between a virus and a living thing is that most living things, their cells clone themselves constantly, but viruses cannot clone themselves on their own. In order to replicate themselves, viruses have to hack into other cells. So while bacteria simply live inside you and cause problems, viruses cause problems by going into your cells and hacking them in order to spread themselves. Different species of virus attack different types of cells. The infamous coronavirus that has caused the world so many problems over a couple of years is primarily spread through breathing and likes to attack lung cells. HIV, which is primarily spread through the sharing of blood or other bodily fluids, likes to attack the cells that are important to the immune system, which leaves you vulnerable to attack from other viruses and bacteria. Rabies, which is primarily spread through mammals biting one another, is primarily attacks brain and nerve cells. So different types of viruses affect different parts of your body. Bacteria are single-celled organisms. Their cells are less complicated than many other types of cells. Bacteria cells are prokaryotic, which means they have very few components. Like most cells, they have genetic material called DNA or sometimes RNA, and the genetic material in the bacteria cell kind of floats freely. Bacteria cells also generally have a cell wall and some things on the outside to help the cell move about. Bacteria are one of several kingdoms of prokaryotic cells, but to keep things simple, we'll just treat all prokaryotic cells as bacteria for the purpose of this video. Bacteria can be found just about everywhere, and there are many species of bacteria living inside you. Some of these species are helpful, and you wouldn't be alive without them. On the other hand, some species of bacteria can be very harmful if they get inside you. One example of a bacteria that is harmful is tuberculosis. Tuberculosis generally lives inside your lungs, but can also live in other parts of the body. They generally spread from person to person through coughing and sneezing. When the tuberculosis bacteria gets inside your lung and starts growing out of control, that causes the tuberculosis disease symptoms, although it is unclear exactly how the bacteria negatively affects your lungs. Another harmful bacterial illness is botulism. There are several different species of bacteria that can cause botulism, and generally people catch these by consuming food that has gone bad from being improperly stored. The bacteria that causes botulism isn't harmful by itself, but under certain conditions in which food is not properly stored, the bacteria starts to give off spores that are harmful to humans. Fortunately, this illness is treatable, and if you think you have symptoms of it, please seek medical attention immediately. Protozoa are a kingdom of living things that have unusual features and don't quite fit into other categories of living things. They are eukaryotic, which means their cells are more complex than bacteria and have more components such as mitochondria and endoplasmic reticulum. Protozoa are usually single-celled creatures. Some protozoa have features like plastids, which plants have, but animals and fungi don't. And a protozoa with plastids might not have a cell wall like plants usually have, so they have some characteristics that would otherwise indicate that they're a plant, but not other characteristics of a plant. An example of protozoa I wish to look at is malaria. Malaria, as you can see in this diagram, does not have a cell wall. It does have a type of plastid that is unique to certain types of protozoa. The epicioplast, which researchers are using to try and find a cure for malaria. Malaria is a parasitic type of protist that its life cycle requires mosquitoes and humans as hosts. Part of the malaria life cycle takes place inside a mosquito, where they infect the mosquito that has bitten an infected human and drinks the blood containing the malaria. Inside the mosquito, sporozoites are produced, and the mosquito then passes those sporozoites into the human bloodstream when it bites a human. They then go to the liver and grow and eventually burst out of the liver cells, and then they go into the blood cells and eventually burst out of the red blood cells. Like bacteria, not all protozoa are harmful to humans, but malaria most certainly is. Fungi are organisms, usually multicellular, made up of eukaryotic cells, and they are very similar to plants and were once classified as plants. But there's a very major difference between plants and fungi. The main difference between them is that fungi lack chloroplasts, which are the things that plant cells use to mix sunlight, water, and air to create food. Fungi do not create their own food. They feed off of other things, and that is the primary difference between a fungus and a plant. Since fungi feed off of other organisms, some of them may feed off of humans. One example of a fungus that infects humans is foot fungus, which foot fungus, also known as athlete's foot, is a fungus that attaches itself to your feet and can be spread through touching infected areas with your feet, often moist places like the bottom of a shower stall. This is why it is advisable to wear flip-flops if you're showering in a dormitory. Foot fungus infection can be really painful and irritating. It causes your foot to itch and skin to peel off. Another type of fungus that infects people is yeast. Yeast are single-celled fungi that grow inside the body in places like the digestive tract and other places. Those bacteria we mentioned earlier, that bacteria that are beneficial that you can't live without, some of them are there to keep the yeast from growing out of control, which is why antibacterial medication can sometimes cause yeast to grow out of control in the body. Yeast infections, when they are out of control, are very painful and irritating, and can and lead to death if the yeast somehow makes it into your bloodstream. If you are infected by yeast or foot fungus or other types of fungus, please see a doctor about antifungal medication and cream. Plants are made up of eukaryotic cells. They are usually multicellular, and a unique feature plants have that other living things don't is plants have chloroplasts in their cells, which are what combine sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water in order to make energy and oxygen, and this energy is needed in order for the plant to live and grow. There are no common diseases that are classified as plants because it is almost impossible for a plant to grow inside the human body. There have been rare cases where a plant has grown inside a body and it can be dangerous. A seed from a pea plant somehow made it into the lung of a man in Massachusetts and sprouted a small pea plant that caused a collapsed lung. As scary as this sounds, it is almost impossible to happen. It is extremely rare because there are so many defenses in your body to prevent it from happening. Now, for that plant to sprout inside its lung, the seed already contained a certain amount of nutrients to get the plant so far. However, once the plant uses the nutrients in its seeds, it cannot grow any further without sunlight, which is why the plant did not grow very far, and why plants do not grow very far or reproduce inside the human body, and it is almost entirely impossible that a species of plant will ever become a communicable disease. Animals are multicellular organisms made up of eukaryotic cells, and unlike plants and fungi, animals can usually move on their own. They do not have cell walls like plants and fungi do. The cell is just surrounded by a membrane. Some people, when they think of animals, just think of animals with the backbones, but the classification of animal also includes things like insects and spiders and worms and jellyfish and, oddly enough, sea sponges and anemones. But we're here to talk about animals that can infect a human body. One type of animal that is treated like an infectious disease is called lice. Lice are a group of insects of a few different species. They live on human skin, drink human blood, and lay eggs on human hair. There are a few different species of lice that go for different parts of the human skin and hair, but the most common species of lice live on top of the head. They are most commonly spread from person to person through sharing hats, brushes, and other things that touch your head. They are not a sign of bad hygiene. They are attracted to your blood no matter how clean or dirty your head is. Lice are more annoying than they are harmful, but some types can carry diseases and inject them into your blood. Another type of animal that is a parasite that feeds off humans is called a tapeworm, of which there are also varying species. You generally get infected with the tapeworm from eating undercooked meat, usually beef, pork, or fish. Tapeworms attach to your intestines, their head bites into your intestine, and then it feeds off of you and takes your nutrients. And then it lays eggs, which then exit your body along with waste, and then can infect other animals, which then in turn infect humans who eat those animals. One of the big dangers of tapeworms is that the eggs go into your muscles and other organs and potentially your brain and nerves, and the larvae grow inside there and form little bubbles called cysts, and this can do a lot of damage to your body's functioning and can cause seizures or even be life-threatening if they are in the brain or nerves. And so this is why you should always make sure to properly cook your meat. If you suspect you have a tapeworm, see a doctor for the proper medication to get rid of it. Cancer is not a communicable disease. You will never catch cancer from being exposed to somebody with cancer. Cancer does not spread from person to person. The reason I am discussing it in this video is because it is, in some sense, alive. As we talked about earlier, living cells usually have the ability to replicate and create copies of themselves in order to grow and replace dying cells. But sometimes, as the DNA is copied over, just as happens when you photocopy something, there are mistakes in the copy. It doesn't come out exactly the same as the original. Sometimes these mistakes don't matter. Sometimes these mistakes are bad enough that the cell dies out before it can keep replicating. But sometimes continues replicating and the damaged cells start growing out of control. And this is what we call cancer. Most cells in the human body start out as a generic cell, but then specialize and become a special type of cell, like a heart cell or a muscle cell or a nerve cell, that performs specific functions in the body. But cancer cells don't specialize, and they stay sort of generic, and they don't perform the functions a cell is supposed to, and they get in the way of the other cells in your body doing what they're supposed to do. And sometimes the cancerous cells form lumps called tumors, and bits of the tumors can break off into the bloodstream and spread to other parts of the body. The immune system does not naturally fight cancer because cancer is not a foreign invader, it is a homegrown threat. Sometimes tumors can be removed by surgery, but sometimes the cancer is a lot harder to remove. In order to treat cancer, what we have to do is try to remove or kill all of the cancerous cells while doing as little damage as possible to the healthy cells. This is a lot easier said than done. Cancer is usually treated using chemotherapy, which uses a series of drugs that poison cells that are growing too rapidly. Unfortunately, in getting rid of the cancer, it also negatively impacts other parts of the body, such as bone marrow and hair growth cells, which is why people who go through chemotherapy lose their hair for a while. Usually the body eventually goes back to normal. Unfortunately, sometimes the cancer cells also return to normal. You have to try and make sure every last one is killed, or else it'll probably return. Like most forms of living things that are pests, if one remains, it might reproduce and go out of control again. One last biological terror I want to talk about is prions. Now, this topic may cause some of you to be paranoid, even more so than the previous illnesses I've talked about. Prions are not alive in the sense that they do not have genetic material. However, they do spread themselves and cause illnesses. There is a protein within the brain and nerve cells called a prion protein. Scientists aren't sure what exactly it does, but it may have something to do with maintaining homeostasis within the brain and nerves. That is, keeping optimal conditions for them to function well. But when the prion protein becomes misfolded, it becomes a dangerous thing called a prion. The prion touches other proteins and causes them to also become misfolded, and that can spread throughout the brain and cause the brain to become spongy and lose a lot of its functions. Diseases generally cause dementia and strange behaviors and eventually death. Nobody is sure what causes prions to form. Sometimes they come seemingly out of nowhere. Some prion diseases have a genetic component to them, where you're more likely to develop them if you have certain genetics. You can also catch a prion disease from eating infected meat, and unfortunately, because they don't have DNA, they cannot be killed by boiling them the way viruses and bacteria can. This is why you should not eat animal brains. One example of a prion disease is mad cow disease, which affects cows, and if you eat meat of an infected cow, you can also develop a human version of this disease. The human version of mad cow disease is called Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. I may not have pronounced that correctly. Another example of a prion disease is fatal insomnia, which comes seemingly out of nowhere, doesn't let you sleep, and gradually kills you over several weeks. Prion diseases are usually fatal. There's not really anything you can do to prevent death once you get them, which is a very scary thought. Prion diseases are extremely rare. Of course, this won't comfort you much if you catch it, but since there is very little that can be done to prevent it, it is best to just live your life with the assumption that it's not going to happen to you. Avoid eating meat that is likely to be infected with prions, and also avoid surgical equipment that might be infected with prions. To summarize, the human body, like all living things, is made up of cells. Each cell contains DNA, and each cell has the ability to replicate itself and make more cells. There are various different types of living things that can infect humans. There are viruses, which are tiny capsules of genetic information that have to hack into other living cells in order to replicate. And then there are bacteria, which are alive and able to replicate on their own, but still get inside the human body sometimes, and while some of them are beneficial, others cause illnesses. And then there are protozoa, complex single-celled organisms, and some types of protozoa, such as malaria, can also infect humans and cause diseases. And then there are fungus, which are usually multicellular and are like plants, except plants make their own food, whereas fungus feed off other things, and so some species of fungus feed off of humans. And then there are animals, which are multicellular creatures that usually can move on their own, and there are certain types of those that also act as infectious agents, such as lice and tapeworms. And then there's cancer, which is not an independently living thing, but it is what happens when the cells in your own body replicate incorrectly and then start replicating out of control. Then there's prions, which aren't alive but do come from inside cells. Specifically, neurons contain prion proteins which can become misfolded and then infect other proteins and cause them to become misfolded, and this causes some degenerative brain diseases. So, all that's gonna make you a little paranoid, but try not to be. Most of these things there are treatments for. If you have symptoms, just contact a doctor. Don't look for information on the internet, because that'll just make you more paranoid. The only classification of living things that is not something that can become a disease is plants. Even though in rare cases a plant can get inside a person and cause issues, plants generally cannot live or reproduce without sunlight, and therefore it is almost impossible that a species of plant will ever become a disease that infects humans. And so, with this diverse array of diseases that we do have to worry about, at least you can rest assured that you don't have to worry about being infected by plants.